The temple at Nauvoo, Illinois, rebuilt in 2002, stands as a monument to the Mormon pioneers. Some 1,500 miles away in St. George, Utah, another temple stands as a tribute to that same pioneer spirit. Over the next half hour, we'll tell the story of Nauvoo, its history, and what it's like there today. Then we'll follow the Mormon Trail to the Salt Lake Valley, then on to St. George. Join me, Russell Wild, as I take you from Nauvoo to St. George. The story of Nauvoo begins in upstate New York. In 1820, Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, was 14 years old. He decided to find out which church was right for him. One day, he went into some woods near his home to pray. In his personal history, Smith wrote what happened next.
Father, in heaven.
As I was praying, I saw a pillar of light. It was exactly over my head. It gradually descended. When the light rested upon me, I saw two personages.
Personages?
Yes, two beings. Their brightness and glory defy all description. One of them spoke to me. He called me by name and said, "This is my beloved son. Hear him." I saw God, Nathan. And I saw his son, Jesus Christ.
That prayer set in motion a series of events that led to the publication of the Book of Mormon and the organization of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in 1830. Over the next few years, the church moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where the first Mormon temple was built. Mob violence forced the young church to flee to Missouri, where the church found temporary refuge in Independence. In 1838, Missouri's governor issued an extermination order, forcing the church to pack up and leave once more. The saints sought refuge in Illinois. Smith led his church to a swampy area along the Mississippi River, and Nauvoo began to grow. Thousands of Mormon settlers flocked to the town. Soon the city of Joseph, as it came to be known, rivaled Chicago. The history of Nauvoo was performed live in a new pageant for the first time this past summer.
Oh, just call me Sister Leonora.
Jules, Mike, please.
And Martha.
Elijah and Anna, each of us had felt God's love, and we yearned to hear his voice.
Like our parents and our grandparents, we knew our Bibles. We knew that if God opened the heavens again, he would speak to us through a prophet like Noah.
We've got to bless these people.
How's your fever? You were practically delirious last night.
And today, I'm well.
Are you? People are dying, my dear. And who is going to take care of you?
If God expects me to look after his children, he will look after me.
And what if you...
Healing them by the power of God. Through the priesthood, you obey as God's will that you should live. Hiram, will you join me?
Yes. And though I've been persecuted for saying so, George, it is true. I know it. And I know that God knows it. And I cannot deny it.
The gospel of Jesus Christ has been restored in its fullness. And I invite you to come, be baptized, receive the gift of the Holy Ghost, and join with us in the house of God.
House of faith, the house of learning, the house of the worship of our God. Here the flock where night retreats dwells will stand a temple unto the Most High, where we will learn of his ways and come in to walk in his paths, that the saints may have a place to worship God, and the Son of Man have where to lay his head.
Three cheers for Zion! Hip hip!
Hooray!
Hip hip! Hip hip! In the temple, we're joined to our families forever, even after we die.
Yes, certain of that then.
If we keep our covenants, we are certain.
I wish I was sure of that. I wish it more than you know.
All together on three. 1, 2, 3.
I now turn the key to you, in the name of God. And this society shall rejoice, and knowledge and intelligence shall flow down from this time. And this is the purpose of the temple, to bring together those who dwell on earth with those who dwell in heaven.
Shortly after 5 o'clock in the evening, the prophet Joseph and his brother Hiram were shot, martyred in defense of the kingdom of God.
Coming up, we'll introduce you to a Southern Utah family that gave up their vacation to take part in the Nauvoo pageant.
Because that we're playing characters that were alive a long time ago, and so we're images of them.
We'll also take you on a tour through the streets of Old Nauvoo.
They built root cellars, dug wells, and built barns, and Nauvoo began to live up to its name and became beautiful.
And Joseph Smith is assassinated, and the Mormon pioneers begin their westward migration as the journey from Nauvoo to St. George continues. Not a lot has changed since the pioneers left Nauvoo in 1846. Wagons still fill the streets, wool is hand spun into yarn and woven by hand. Of course, these aren't pioneers, they're missionaries from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, recreating the feel of Old Nauvoo for the thousands of people who visit the city each year. Among those missionaries is a family from Cedar City who sacrificed 2 weeks of their summer to be part of the inaugural cast of the Nauvoo pageant.
He laid down his life for us, that we might live forever in the kingdom of our God.
It tells the story of the restoration of the church, and it does it in such a way that every story is true, every character on stage is true, so that it is authentic. And in that process, you feel the power and spirit of those pioneers.
Because that we're playing characters that were alive a long time ago, and so we're images of them.
The Goodmansons learned their roles in the heat of the day on a stage designed specifically for this production.
Basically 100-degree weather, and that plywood stage, I'm sure, was just radiated the heat and the humidity. At times, yeah, it felt like a sacrifice, but in the end, it brought such great joy and such great blessings.
The pageant tells the story of Nauvoo, the organization of the city, the martyrdom of the Mormon prophet Joseph Smith in nearby Carthage.
It will not stop the honest in heart from believing this gospel.
The construction of the temple and the pioneer exodus. Visitors can see the production at night and experience the locations in person the next day.
It's like living it. It's like you walk down the streets and you know these people walk down the streets.
It was on these streets that the Goodmanson family came to really know the pioneers.
Probably best said the way my son and some others have also said, it felt like we were really living here in the 1800s. I have to say that I have grown closer to the prophet Joseph Smith. I felt like I knew him before. I'd read everything he'd ever written or ever said, but yet I feel like I'm closer to him than I ever have been.
One of the best ways to get a feel for Old Nauvoo is to tour the historic city in a horse-drawn wagon.
They built root cellars, dug wells, and built barns, and Nauvoo began to live up to its name and became beautiful. The Lion Drug Store is also on our left. Windsor Lion first built a little log drugstore on the corner, and in 1843 built the brick structure for his family. On the left is the Jonathan Browning gunsmith. He was credited with inventing the repeating rifles. The gun shop and old blacksmith shop are located on the north, and the original log home in which the family lived is still behind the south end of this building. Brigham Young was America's greatest Western colonizer. He became the second president of the church after the martyrdom of the prophet Joseph Smith. And Brigham Young directed the western migration of more than 70,000 Mormons and carried out the colonization of more than 350 settlements there in the West. America's greatest colonizer, statesman, and pioneer. Between the years of 1846 and 1847, it is estimated that over 3,000 wagons traveled down this little street to get to the Mississippi River. We ask that everyone in Nauvoo take the time to walk down Parley Street and get the spirit of the pioneers who made the long and difficult trek to the west. This was one of the earliest brick buildings erected in Nauvoo. It was built in 1841 as a two-story structure with a full basement. It opened for business January 5, 1842. Historically speaking, the most important part of the building was the second floor. It contained one large room and two small ones, serving as the general office of the church, the town hall, and the courthouse. On this second floor, the Relief Society was organized. The Prophet's General Mercantile Store comprised the entire first floor. The homestead on the right is the first home in Nauvoo where Joseph and his family lived. The traditional story is that the log home was built in 1803. The most significant structure to rise above the Nauvoo landscape was the majestic temple. The purpose of the temple is a place for the members of the church to meet and participate in sacred ordinances. The temple overlooks the entire countryside from the eastern bank of the Mississippi River. It was then and is now the crown jewel of this unique city. The rebuilt version replicates the 1846 exterior in terms of design and dimension. The interior has been updated to meet current demands.
Next, Joseph Smith is killed in nearby Carthage jail. The church members finish their temple and move west across Iowa as the journey from Nauvoo to St. George continues. In June 1844, work continued on the temple, but the whole countryside was in turmoil. Militia mobilized, and Joseph Smith ordered Nauvoo be placed under martial law. It was under these conditions that Smith went to nearby Carthage to answer charges of rioting and treason. The Mormon prophet's brother Hiram accompanied him to the nearby jail. As they left Nauvoo, Joseph turned to his brother and said, quote, "This is the loveliest place and the best people under the heavens. Little do they know the trials that await them." As they were nearing Carthage, Joseph spoke to the company, saying, quote, "I'm going like a lamb to the slaughter, but I am calm as a summer's morning. I have a conscience void of offense towards God and towards all men. I shall die innocent, and it shall yet be said of me, he was murdered in cold blood." There were 4 men being held in the Carthage jail: Joseph Smith, his brother Hiram, John Taylor, and Willard Richards. The jailer moved the group out of the cell and into his personal bedroom. John Taylor wrote what happened next.
"We announce the martyrdom of Joseph Smith the prophet and Hiram Smith the patriarch. They were shot in Carthage jail on the 27th of June, 1844, about 5 o'clock p.m., by an armed mob, painted black. Hiram was shot first and fell calmly, exclaiming, 'I am a dead man.' Joseph leaped from the window and was shot dead in the attempt, exclaiming, 'O Lord my God.' They were both shot after they were dead, in a brutal manner, and both received 4 balls. John Taylor and Willard Richards, 2 of the 12, were the only persons in the room at the time. The former was wounded in a savage manner with 4 balls, but has since recovered. The latter, through the providence of God, escaped without even a hole in his robe.
Coming up, the death of their prophet inspires the Mormons in Nauvoo to finish their temple, and their exodus to the west begins. The Mormon settlers spent 7 years on the banks of the Mississippi River. In that time, the city grew in size and had a population that rivaled Chicago. While in Nauvoo, the persecution of the early Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints continued. On June 27, 1844, the church's founder, Joseph Smith, was murdered by a mob while being held in nearby Carthage jail. The death of their prophet inspired the saints in Nauvoo to finish the temple. As soon as the temple was completed, the saints were again forced to leave their homes.
Originally, as they left Nauvoo, they were anticipating making the trek all the way to the Rocky Mountains that year. But because of bad weather and rain and illness and many things that happened, Brigham Young, who was their leader, made the decision that they would spend the winter here on the Missouri.
After an arduous journey through the rain and mud of Iowa, the saints found refuge here in Winter Quarters, Nebraska.
The trek through Iowa was a historic trek, much disease, much trial and tribulation.
That first winter in Nebraska took its toll on the pioneers.
The north wind began to howl with renewed strength and filled our little shanty full of its cold and piercing breath. The weather had increased in coldness. Hosea Stout.
369 people died that winter. Over half were children. Only one original headstone remains in the cemetery near a statue memorial to the tragedy at Winter Quarters.
It's called the tragedy at Winter Quarters. It really was not a tragedy. It was a triumph over the difficulties and death.
On April 5, 1847, Brigham Young led the advance company out of Winter Quarters. After traveling over 1,000 miles, the company entered the Salt Lake Valley on July 24, 1847. Brigham Young looked out over the valley and declared, "This is the right place. Drive on." One of the first things that Brigham Young did after entering the Salt Lake Valley was to designate a spot for the pioneers to build a temple. After only 1 month in the valley, Young made the trek back across the Rocky Mountains to the banks of the Missouri River, where the saints built a tabernacle and sustained Brigham Young as the new president of the church. Over the next 40 years, over 100,000 Mormons would begin their trip west from this settlement. By the early 1860s, thousands of Mormon pioneers had settled in the Salt Lake Valley. Brigham Young sent explorers to find the things that the new settlement would need. In 1861, Young sent over 300 families to the southwestern part of the territory to colonize the area and grow cotton. What those early settlers found wasn't very inviting.
It was just desert, no trees, grasshoppers, rattlesnakes, all kinds of varmints really, and no food.
Many of the early residents of St. George were asked to give up their homes once more to follow Brigham Young.
The prophet was going to build this area down here, and they left their farms and everything up there, and they followed the prophet's word and come down here. They were very loyal to him.
Coming up after the break, work begins on the St. George Temple.
But they filled it with lead and pounded the volcanic rock in to try to make a good enough foundation.
Just 10 years after its settlement, Brigham Young asked another sacrifice of the settlers of St. George: build a temple. After surveying the town, Young chose the spot that the saints would build the temple.
Brigham Young said this will be the center of town, and it'll be surrounded by flowering trees and homes and a beautiful city.
But the location wasn't without its problems.
This whole half was really a bog when they started to build it. And so they took a cannon, they filled it with lead and pounded the volcanic rock in to try to make a good enough foundation.
The temple's architecture was based on the Nauvoo temple and was constructed out of local sandstone and painted white. It took just 5.5 years to build, making it the first temple finished in Utah. From its humble beginnings as an outpost for cotton, St. George has grown to the city it is today, fulfilling the prophetic vision of Brigham Young.
And he said at one time, between these volcanic knolls and mountains here, there would be cities with churches, temples, spires, and people of all nations, in which there is today.
The Nauvoo temple was dedicated in 1846. In the 30 years between that dedication and the dedication of the St. George Temple in 1877, thousands of pioneers streamed across the plains and into the Salt Lake Valley. Today, thousands of people from all walks of life continue to stream into Washington County. No matter how many people move to the area, the pioneer heritage will always be at the heart of St. George.